The hotel administrator thought he was just another guest, treating him with disrespect and arrogance. But she had no idea. It was not just a guest. It was Habib Nurmagomedov, the owner of the hotel. What happened next shocked everyone. Stay tuned, and we will take you through this unforgettable encounter that will remind you that true strength lies not in power or status, but in standing up for those who need it most. You won't believe Habib's reaction. It will stay with you long after you hear this story. If you like stories that inspire and touch you, be sure to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel to see even more powerful content. Evening came, enveloping the city in a warm glow as the towering hotel stood proudly in the heart of luxury. This was no ordinary hotel. This was an elite 5-star establishment known for catering to the world's most prominent guests. Business tycoons, celebrities, and royalty often passed through its front entrance, where uniformed doormen stood at attention, ready to open the doors with a respectful nod. Inside, the lobby was a masterpiece of design, with towering marble columns, intricate gold details, and a crystal chandelier that sparkled like a constellation in the dim lighting. The scent of fresh roses mingled with the soft aroma of select coffee brewed in the hotel's cafe, where guests sat in elegant armchairs discussing deals worth millions over cups of imported espresso. Inside, there was an air of sophistication where appearances spoke louder than words. Everything about the hotel exuded wealth, and its staff was carefully trained to recognize and serve only the most important guests. Bellhops moved quickly, their uniforms crisp and their manners impeccable, while receptionists sat behind the large front desk, their smiles polished but selective. Those dressed in expensive designer brands were greeted with immediate warmth, while others, those who didn't look quite the same, were sometimes met with skeptical glances. That's exactly what this hotel was, a place where perception often dictated reality. And on this night, a man walked in who didn't fit the usual mold. He wasn't accompanied by a team of assistants. He didn't get out of his luxury car or carry himself with the arrogance of a man accustomed to flaunting his wealth. He was dressed in a simple black tracksuit and a simple baseball cap pulled low over his face. He carried only a small travel bag slung carelessly over his shoulder as he walked to the front desk with an easy, unhurried gait. To the untrained eye, he looked like just another traveler, perhaps an athlete, a personal, or even someone who had taken a turn into the world of high society. He didn't have the brightness of the usual VIP guests, and he didn't seem concerned with making an impression. But most people didn't notice. What the receptionist behind the counter completely overlooked was the quiet confidence in his posture, the way he held himself with a calm self-assurance that only came with years of discipline and experience. He was not a man who needed to prove himself to anyone. The receptionist, however, saw none of this. She was a young woman in her early 20s, dressed in a perfectly pressed uniform that matched the image of the hotel's elite standards. Her blonde hair was styled in a sleek, professional bun, and her painted fingernails tapped on the desk as she stared at her computer screen. She had worked at this hotel for 3 years, and in that time she had learned to assess guests at a glance. Wealth, power, and importance could be determined not only by, but by the way a man walked, the way he acted. And to her, this man, dressed in something so casual, carrying nothing but a traveling bag, did not belong. She barely looked up as he approached. Instead, she sighed softly as she continued tapping her fingers on the keyboard. When she finally acknowledged him, it was with a tinge of impatience, as if she had better things to do. "Yes," she said evenly. Her tone was devoid of warmth. "May I help you?" The man remained composed, giving her a polite nod before he began to speak. But before he could get a few words out, she interrupted him, having already made her judgment. "If you're looking for the gym, it's in the back," she said, and there was a slight smirk in her voice. She assumed he was some kind of fighter. Maybe a personal trainer or a bodyguard. Someone who worked for the people who actually stayed at this hotel, not someone who could afford the room himself. This is a premium establishment, sir. Reservations are required for guests. She let the words hang in the air, making sure her message was clear. Her posture, her tone, and even the way she barely maintained eye contact all screamed the same unspoken statement. You don't belong here. The man didn't react immediately. He didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. Instead, he simply looked at her, his expression impenetrable. There was no anger or frustration in his eyes, only an almost mocking patience, as if he had seen this kind of treatment before, as if he was testing her, waiting to see how far she would go in this mistake. But the receptionist, not realizing who she was talking to, only confused herself even more. We're all booked up for the night, she added dismissively, though it wasn't entirely true. There were still rooms available, but she saw no need to offer them to him. Perhaps you'll have better luck at another hotel. There was silence for a moment. The grand lobby, with its soft classical music and mumbling voices, seemed to freeze. A few guests nearby looked in their direction, sensing the tension in the air. Then a man spoke up, his voice calm and even. So you're saying I don't belong here? The receptionist barely concealed her irritation. I'm saying that this hotel caters to a certain level of clientele, she said in a harsh tone. If you don't have a reservation, there's nothing I can do. It was at that moment that a man in a strict suit entered the lobby. His presence was authoritative, his posture stiff and professional. This was the senior manager of the hotel, a man who had worked under present owner for years. And second, his gaze fell on the man in the tracksuit. His entire demeanor changed. His face turned pale, his breathing slightly hitched as he saw the scene. The disdainful pose of the receptionist, the arrogant smirk still lingering on her lips, and the calm, composed expression of the man she had just insulted. And then in a voice that shocked the entire lobby, the manager spoke. Mr. Nurmagomedov, he said, almost panting. A mixture of respect and pure terror could be heard in his voice. At the mention of the name, the administrator's expression twitched. The smirk disappeared, replaced by confusion, then disbelief, then something resembling fear. The manager's words through the lobby, drawing the attention of several guests and employees nearby. The man in the tracksuit she'd just rejected, without hesitation, had been Habib Nurmagomedov, an undefeated UFC champion, a world icon, a man whose discipline, strength, and honor have earned him worldwide respect, and most importantly, the owner of the very hotel where she worked. For the first time that evening, the receptionist felt her confidence crumble. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned to look at him. Her mind was frantically trying to realize the seriousness of what she had just done. She hadn't just insulted a guest. She had insulted her host. And now, standing before him, she realized, too late, that she had made the biggest mistake of her career. The silence that ensued was tense. The secretary, still frozen in place, felt her heart pounding in her ears as the weight of her mistake descended on her like a suffocating fog. Her fingers, which moments ago had been tapping confidently on the polished counter, now clenched nervously at her sides. The realization struck her like lightning. She had humiliated Habib Nurmagomedov, the undefeated UFC champion, a world icon, and most importantly, the owner of this very hotel. For a moment, she pleaded that it was some kind of misunderstanding. Perhaps it was a different Habib. Perhaps she had misheard the manager. But when she hesitantly raised her gaze to look at the man in front of her, she found not a trace of denial in the expression on his face. He was calm, too calm, and that, more than anything else, scared her. The manager, on the other hand, was anything but calm. He hurried forward, nearly tripping over his own polished shoes, his face a mask of pure panic. Drops of sweat began to gather on his temples as he addressed Habib with deep, nervous respect. "Mr. Nurmagomedov," he said hastily, his voice trembling slightly, "I deeply apologize for this misunderstanding. It is absolutely unacceptable. I can assure you that this is not how we do business here." The secretary swallowed hard, but Habib didn't react. His gaze remained fixed on her, unreadable, making her squirm uncomfortably under his gaze. The expression on his face wasn't of anger or proud revenge. It was something far worse, disappointment, and that, more than anything, made her stomach clench. The manager turned sharply toward the receptionist. His tone was now streaked with barely concealed rage. What exactly happened here? The receptionist opened her mouth, desperately trying to salvage the situation. "Yeah," she muttered, trying to gather her thoughts. "I didn't know. I just thought—" Habib finally spoke. His voice cut through the tension as if blade. "What did you think?" His tone was calm, but there was an undeniable heaviness in it that made the air seem heavier. The secretary turned away, her throat dry. "Yeah. I thought you weren't a guest here," she admitted. Her voice was barely louder than a whisper. Habib nodded slowly, as if pondering her words. Then, with quiet precision, he asked, "And what made you assume that?" The question hung in the air, forcing the secretary to face a truth she had tried to ignore. She had judged him by his appearance, by his plain clothes, his lack of arrogance, his humble presence. To her, he didn't look rich enough, important enough to belong to such a place, and so she brushed him off without further thought. Habib let the silence linger, giving her a chance to reflect on her actions. Around them, several guests and staff members watched, their gazes darting between the champion and the woman who dared to humiliate him. Some were whispering amongst themselves, unable to believe what they had just seen. The manager, feeling the need to act, turned to Habib. "Sir, please let me handle this matter. This level of disrespect is totally unacceptable, and I assure you it will not go unpunished." But before he could finish, Habib raised his hand, signaling him to stop. The manager immediately fell silent, his mouth still slightly ajar, waiting for the champion's verdict. Habib took a slow breath and looked directly at the administrator. "Do you know what respect means?" he asked. His tone was unwavering. The receptionist blinked, caught off guard by the question. "Yes, of course," she answered quickly. Her voice was quiet. Habib's gaze did not waver. "Respect isn't just for the rich. It's not just for those who come in expensive suits. It's for everyone." The words hit deeper than any profanity or punishment. The secretary felt her chest tighten as the truth took root. She had spent years believing that wealth defined value, that only those who could afford luxuries deserved to be treated with dignity. But in that moment, standing in front of Habib, she realized how deeply flawed that belief was. Habib continued, his voice steady but firm. "I could have come in here as a guest, as a businessman, or as someone looking for a place to stay. And yet you treated me as if I were beneath you, not because of who I am, but because of who you thought I was." The registrar's face burned with shame. She wanted to apologize, to explain that she meant no harm, but deep she knew her actions spoke louder than any of excuses she could offer. Habib finally tore his gaze away, glaring at the manager. "I don't want her fired," he said simply. The secretary exhaled, not realizing she'd been holding her breath. But before she could feel any relief, he added, "I want her to learn a lesson from this." The manager nodded vigorously. "Certainly, sir. I will provide proper training immediately." Habib turned to the administrator one last time. "Next time, don't judge people by what they wear. Judge them by how they behave, by their actions." And with those words, he turned and walked away, leaving behind a silence that was weightier than any outburst of anger. The secretary, standing motionless at the counter, felt as if her whole world had just turned upside down. She had expected punishment, humiliation, or even the loss of her job. Instead, she received something far more valuable, a lesson she would never forget. That night, as she replayed the events in her head, she realized something important. Respect isn't just about recognizing power or status. It's about humanity. And in that moment, she realized why Habib Nurmagomedov was not just a champion in the ring, he was a champion in life. When Habib left, the air in the lobby remained thick with tension. The receptionist froze behind the counter, clutching the edge of her desk with her hands as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. She was ready for an explosion of anger, for public humiliation, maybe even immediate dismissal. But what she got was far more crushing. Habib's quiet disappointment, his piercing words that refused to leave her mind. The guests who witnessed the exchange whispered among themselves. Some looked at Habib with renewed admiration, while others cast disapproving glances at the receptionist, silently asking themselves how she could have made such a grave mistake. The hotel manager, still clearly shaken, wiped his forehead with a trembling hand before stepping towards Habib with a renewed sense of urgency. "Mr. Nurmagomedov," he said cautiously, lowering his voice as if fearing more embarrassment, "please allow us to rectify this. I insist on giving you the presidential suite, free of charge. We would be honored to have you as our guest." Habib paused, turning his head slightly to look at the manager. Something flashed in his eyes, not arrogance, not anger, but a quiet understanding of the world around him. He had seen it before, a willingness to make amends only after realizing someone's status, a willingness to offer luxuries only when the person was deemed worthy. He shook his head slightly. "I don't need special treatment," he said firmly. "That's not why I came here." The manager blinked, clearly unprepared for that answer. Most dignitaries would have taken full advantage of the situation, demanding apologies, compensation, or even dismissal. But Habib wasn't like most people. He never needed wealth or status to define him, and he certainly didn't need to prove anything now. "I just wanted to see how people are treated here," Habib continued, and his tone carried an instructive rather than reproachful tone. "Not just people who wear expensive suits, not just people who look like they belong here. Everything." The words struck deeply, sending a wave of silence through the staff gathered nearby. The secretary, still trying to comprehend what had happened, felt a lump come up to her throat. She had been exposed, not as someone who demanded retribution, but as someone who had simply held up a mirror to her own actions. And the reflection was unflattering. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, and for the first time since their interaction had begun, she found herself actually regretting her actions. It wasn't just about the mistake at work. It was about her values, the way she saw people, the way she'd been taught to judge value by looks rather than character. Gathering all her courage, she took a slow, intermittent breath and stepped forward. "Mr. Nurmagomedov," she said, her voice quieter, stripped of its former arrogance. I'm so sorry. I underestimated you. I shouldn't have treated you like that." Habib turned to look at her. The expression on his face was impenetrable. He didn't relish her apology, or gloat, or take satisfaction in her discomfort. Instead, he simply nodded. "Apology accepted," he said in an even voice. "But remember, this isn't about me. It's about how everyone who walks through those doors." The secretary felt her cheeks burn with shame, but also something else, understanding. The lesson Habib had taught would not just disappear. It would stay with her, changing her approach to work, her perception of people, her assessment of values. As Habib turned to leave, the manager, still eager to make things right, shouted one last time, "Sir, please, at least let us arrange a proper reception for you." Habib looked back, giving him a small look, with an understanding smile. "The best greeting," he said simply, "is respect. And with those words, he away, leaving behind a lesson that changed not just one person, but an entire institution. Entire institution. Entire institution.